Okay, so today I'm going to demonstrate a technique, monochrome, but using liquid pigment instead of dry pigment such as charcoal or Conte or pastel or wax pencil. And I'll be using oil paint, and the color I'm using will be burnt umber. It has a little bit of life to it. It's not totally dead like black, and yet it has a dark enough quality so that I can paint the darkest darks using it too. I'll also supplement that with some black so that at the end my darkest darks can be punched in using the black paint, although I won't mingle it with the burnt umber during any of the other parts of the demonstration. This is sometimes called an underpainting, or in Italian, an imprimatura, I-M-P-R-I-M-A-T-U-R-A. And we find this in painters that are contemporary and also painters like Rembrandt. If you look at some of his works, you'll see areas where he didn't even cover over the underpainting, but he applied his pigment, his colors, on top of it, sometimes while it was still wet and sometimes while it was dry. So we're not going to use white. You can do monochrome studies using white and any dark color, but for this we're going to use oil transparently. So I'm going to cover the canvas first using burnt umber and a mixture of linseed oil with paint thinner or mineral spirits. Depending on the temperature inside your studio, or if you're not doing any temperature control, it could be hot and dry. If that's the case, then you want to have a ratio of about 1 part linseed oil to 3 parts mineral spirits. If, on the other hand, if it's a cold or damp climate, then you probably want to switch over to 1 part of linseed oil and 4 parts of the mineral spirits. And so we also use mineral spirits in a separate container, and in that we clean our brushes. So we apply the paint using linseed oil mixed with mineral spirits, and then we clean the brushes using just mineral spirits themselves. You can use turpentine instead of the mineral spirits, but it tends to be a little bit gummy, and it takes a toll on your paint brushes. So that's why I tend to stick with just what they call paint thinner or mineral spirits. I've got a palette. It's a glass palette with a gray piece of pastel paper underneath it. And that's a middle gray of 50%. It's not more black, nor is it more white. It's halfway between. That way, when I put my color, or in this case, just these burnt umber, on top of it, I can gauge the value of the paint that I'm about to apply to the canvas. So that's my preferred palette. I also am going to be using t-shirt rags. You can see they're one of the most important art supplies you've got. These are cotton t-shirt rags, and they absorb just the right amount of the pigment, and I can use them to go back into the field of burnt umber and rub out my lights. As in the case here, we see the forehead is one big light area, and the collar is the lightest light. So when I'm looking at anything, whether I'm going to be drawing with charcoal or whether I'm going to be painting, I always, at the beginning, I look at the area that's my lightest light and my darkest dark. So the darkest dark is right here, under the brow. And the background can be equally dark. The lightest light is the collar. And so don't just consider the head itself, but its background and its clothing and any other props that may be inside the picture frame that you're going to paint. To apply the paint, I'm going to use a simple house painting brush. You can pick these up at the hardware store. This is a little bit narrow. I usually suggest about a 3-inch brush. The canvas is a stretched canvas, but you can use a canvas board, or you can gesso This is gesso, simple white acrylic gesso. Or you can apply gesso using a brush similar to this on top of a masonite board. And that creates a really good surface for this process and others too. So here's my mixture of linseed with the paint thinner. And then here is my paint thinner by itself for cleaning the brushes. Q-tips can be handy too. I might be working on smaller areas of detail where these are simpler than a brush. And with a Q-tip, you can apply more pressure than you can with a brush. So that's nice. I'm going to mostly use soft synthetic filbert brushes. Filbert brush has a rounded beveled edge at the outside as opposed to a flat, which is straight. I'm also going to use, again, synthetic soft round brushes like this. This brush, when wet with paint, will come to a nice fine point, and it'll be necessary for areas of smaller detail. So in this case, this is a stretched canvas. It came straight from the store. It's gessoed properly, that is to say, enough gesso, enough prime. Sometimes you'll buy these canvases, different brand, and it won't have enough primer or gesso. And so you may have to then just gesso your own surface on top of such a canvas. But this one's nice and has a nice bounce, and I like that bounce. See, I've already messed it up. I like that bounce. You can't get that with a canvas board, but you can certainly do a lot of really good work with those too, and they're cheap. So let me start then by applying some of the linseed mix, the linseed mixed with the mineral spirits. And I'm just going to cover the whole canvas. If you've done watercolor, you're probably familiar with painting wet on wet. In other words, you're going to get these out here. You're going to coat your watercolor board, and then on top of it, you can paint with wet pigment, and it'll tend to blend together and simplify. Okay, then using one of your t-shirt rags, you can just dry the brush. So right now this is a wet surface, and I'm going to apply to it the pigment. The pigment that I'll be using here is simply burnt umber. I'll wet my filbert brush, and you see what happens with the paint. I don't think I'll do a vignette today. I'll paint out to the edges of the canvas. Even though it smears and it's wet, it still fairly well holds its shape, as you can see when I apply the pigment. Remember, you can't really do this on a raw sheet of paper. It will not, eventually the oil in the paint and the medium would destroy the paper itself. But here, the canvas is sealed, in this case with gesso. You can do a drawing on the canvas first, and when you're satisfied with it, and you've kept it light enough, then at that point, you can put Floetrol, spelled Floetrol. And that is essentially the same thing that they sell at art stores. They call it matte medium. It's cheaper if you go to a paint department in a good hardware store and ask for Floetrol. House painters use it to mix with latex paint. And so it's acrylic, and it will go down on top of your canvas, and it goes down purely transparently, so you can see your pencil or your charcoal line drawing wax pencil underneath. And once the Floetrol has been spread over it, and with a hair dryer you can dry that very quickly. Well, once that's been done, then the surface of your whatever canvas you're using will have been sealed. And yet, when it's dry, you can work right on it and you can see your drawing coming through. If I'm doing an illustration, for instance, with its deadline, and I really want to make sure everything is exactly placed where my drawing was originally designed, in a case like that, then I might do, in fact I probably would, do a pencil or a wax pencil drawing underneath, and then I would fix it using Floetrol. First thing I would do actually is I would take spray fixative. I would spray the drawing, and then I would apply the Floetrol over that, each one having to be dry as you go. Here, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to paint from scratch with no drawing, relying on drawing with the brush. You know, when you're working with something like Conte or charcoal or wax pencil, you're basically doing, if you're working tonally, you're doing a monochrome painting, except it won't be wet. When you're working with paint, think of it as a monochrome drawing with a brush. Now, at this point, notice I'm taking one of the t-shirt rags, and I'm just evening everything out. So you have to have several t-shirt rags because you go through them. This should also take away the glare which necessarily we get at the first layer. And that'll help you as you start the drawing, which is to say the painting. So I've done one t-shirt rag. Now I switch over to the next. I save that t-shirt rag. When it dries, I can use it for all kinds of things later. But for now, this is all I need. And I do it very lightly. You see my fingers through the tissue, and then just like this. No pressure. Now this doesn't have to be perfectly airbrush smooth, but it should present a uniform, smooth surface. The paint is certainly still dry. You know, it'll stay dry for your entire session. And we also know that you can work into it while it's wet, but if it dries, then you cannot. You can only go dark on top. So you want to get the areas that are the lightest and get those in first.